As Laura said, I'm Vanessa Burholt. I'm from Swansea University and I'm the Director of the Centre for Innovative Ageing. Today I want to talk to you about the impact of exclusion from social resources on loneliness in later life from older people in Wales. And this is hot off the press. This is data straight from CFAS Wales Study, which has literally only come into our hands in the last month or so. I'm going to talk a little bit about the risks and influences on loneliness and look at one particular pathway to loneliness. I'm looking at this slightly differently from the way that Emily explained in terms of health as an outcome, but looking at health and disability as a potential trigger for pathways to loneliness. I'm going to use the CFAS Wales data to model a pathway to loneliness and then finish with some conclusions and key issues for research, policy and practice. I'm going to draw on the discrepancy theory, which Emily mentioned briefly earlier, which talks about loneliness as a discrepancy between someone's actual levels of social relations and the desired levels of social relations that they have. So in other words, social isolation doesn't always equal loneliness, because a person who has one friend and is happy with that one friend won't necessarily express loneliness. Someone else may have 10 friends or 10 members of their family, yet want more and could experience loneliness even with that number of people around them. So I'm going to use that as a central part of this pathway to loneliness. Those mismatches between the actual level of social resources that someone has and their desired levels of social resources may arise due to certain life events that we might think of as triggers to loneliness. These might be things such as bereavement, so the loss of a spouse or the loss of a confidant. They may arise due to migration, either of an older person themselves, of their family members or of friends. Or it might be that ill health stops them being able to visit or maintain the relationships that they have with other people. And to date, again, as Emily mentioned, it's almost like we had a double act here, the environmental influences on the social relationships and social participation and on loneliness have really to date been neglected. That's with the exception, perhaps, of one paper that I published last year with Tom Scharf, looking at Irish data, which looked at the influence of rural environments on loneliness. And to a certain extent, the paper I'm presenting here today was to see if the same relationships we found that looked at the rural environment and its influence on social participation and social resources was also replicated in Wales. I'm drawing on CFAS Wales Study, which is a large-scale nationally representative study for people aged 50, actually that's aged 65 and over, sorry about that, in Wales. The study was originally conducted in 1993, and 20 years on, we're conducting the second wave of this study. There are 5 centres, 3 of those are in England, but I'm only drawing on the data from Wales because we're interested in particular on psychosocial and environmental determinants of wellbeing outcomes for older people and also cognitive impairment. In Wales, we have 2 study centres, one in North Wales in Gwynedd, which is a predominantly rural area, and one in South Wales, which is a post-industrial area in Neathport Talbot, but also comprises rural areas too. It's a predominantly white British sample, and we conducted face-to-face interviews with 3,500 older people aged 65 and over. We're presently collecting data for Wave 2, so 2 years apart from the first data collection, we're collecting longitudinal data. So in answer to some of those questions earlier, we will have longitudinal data with loneliness measured at least 2 time points. This presentation only draws on the first wave of data for people with no missing data, so we've got about 3,400 people in the sample that I'm drawing on. This is the pathway to loneliness that I'm hypothesizing and that I want to try and model with some of this data. In this particular pathway, there are certain predisposing factors that might be associated with a precipitating event. These might be things such as gender, education, marital status, and will mean that people are more or less likely to experience a precipitating event. Those events, as I've already mentioned, might be things like migration, bereavement, or ill health. Things such as migration then may disrupt people's actual social relations, so those contact that people have with people or the way that they participate in social groups, but they also may influence expectations about those relationships and the desire to have certain relationships. And I've mentioned that the discrepancy between those two will lead to an experience of loneliness if they're mismatched. If you desire a greater level of social interaction than that you're receiving, you're likely to have this negative experience of loneliness. In this particular context, in this particular pathway, though, I want to take into account the environmental context and see how that may influence actual social relations of older people. So in the model, we're drawing on 4 different predisposing factors that I'll be including in the model as controls. That's age, marital status, gender and education. The precipitating event, in this case, I'm going to use health, but captured in the Townsend Disability Score. And this looks at a person's disability from no incapacity to severe incapacity. Environmental context is captured with 2 variables. One, I'm going to look at urban versus rural areas. And secondly, I'm going to look at the deprivation of an area. And I'll be using the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation. For urban versus rural areas, I'm using DEFRA's classification of areas with all urban areas grouped together versus rural areas. Social relations are captured by 2 variables. One looks at social resources, and that's the quality and quantity of relationships that a person says that they have, and I'm using the Lubbock social network scale. And social participation captures the breadth of participation of an older people in various social groups. So, for example, environmental groups, leisure groups, political groups, education, and art groups. And finally, loneliness is captured using the De Jong-Geerveld short loneliness scale, which uses 6 items without mentioning the word loneliness to capture the extent of someone's loneliness. I'm going to be presenting some statistical models, and as I know, I have a mixed audience here. I'm going to use pictures as well as a model. So, in essence, I was starting off with the mediation model, and this suggests that there is a direct link between the disability that someone has and loneliness. But in addition to that direct link, I hypothesize that disability will influence the way in which someone can access their friends. And so for those who have a greater level of disability, that will become more problematic for them, and they're likely to have fewer social resources they draw on. And that, in turn, will influence loneliness. So there's a pathway that goes from disability to loneliness, but partly that's going to be accounted for through the pathway through friendships. And I also suggest that there's the same relationship between participation in group activities. This is the statistical model. If you don't like that, just remember the pictures. The diagram on the left shows that indeed there is a direct pathway from disability to loneliness. And we can see that those with a higher level of disability have greater levels of loneliness. The diagram on the right shows that that main effect of disability on loneliness is decreased when we add in the measure of social resources. So in part, the effect of disability on loneliness is accounted for by its effect on social resources. So those who are more disabled than others have fewer social resources, and those with fewer social resources experience a higher level of loneliness. This is the same pattern we see for social participation. Those with higher levels of chronic disabilities have lower levels of social participation, and lower levels of social participation result in higher levels of loneliness. But as you'll notice, this yet doesn't have any environmental context. So the next step of the analysis was to look at the relationship between disability and social resources and take into account environment. So in this context, I'm expecting that a deprived neighbourhood is going to amplify the difficulties that someone might have with chronic disability in accessing their friends. So, for example, a deprived neighbourhood may feel unsafe to venture out in, which may mean people don't go out there. Or a deprived neighbourhood may not have transport resources that help people visit friends. I'm also including a second variable that's going to represent rural versus urban areas. And again, the expectation is that in rural areas, it will amplify the difficulty that someone has with chronic conditions and with disability in accessing their friends. So both of my environmental factors I'm expecting to make a contribution by making the situation worse in terms of accessing friends. And the same applies for accessing group activities. So the first diagram is the moderated mediation model for social resources. The red triangle is the original mediation model. We can see in this time that disability doesn't directly affect loneliness. It's no longer significant. And this means that the pathway to loneliness is accounted for by the covariates in the model, by the indirect pathway through social resources, and by the other variables that I've included in the model. So there's still a relationship whereby higher levels of disability mean fewer social resources, which in turn mean higher levels of loneliness. But the two lines at the bottom, the green lines, show the influence of rural-urban environments on loneliness. And here we see a direct effect. In rural areas, people experience higher levels of loneliness. But what we don't see is an interaction between rural urban environments on social resources. We do have an interaction between disability and rural urban environments, and the relationship is changed. And it's easier if I show this in a different diagram. So overall, older people living in rural areas have higher levels of loneliness. But if we compare rural areas and urban areas at different levels of disability, we see a very interesting thing happen. You can see the slope for people in rural areas is somewhat less than the slope of increased loneliness for people in urban areas. At some incapacity, we see that switch, where people in urban areas experience greater levels of loneliness than those in rural areas. And the gap between the levels of loneliness in rural and urban areas increases at appreciable incapacity and then at severe incapacity. So at levels of severe incapacity, those in urban areas have much greater levels of loneliness than those in rural areas. And I'll come back to try and explain that later on. This is a second model, which looks at the impact of environmental factors on social participation. The red triangle, again, shows the original mediation model. And once again, we see no direct effect of disability on loneliness, and this is accounted for by the other variables in the model. We'll still see that disability decreases social participation, and lower levels of social participation increase loneliness. And once again, we've seen the same effect of the rural-urban environment. So the same chart I just showed you applies to this too. But in this model, we also see that deprived environments have an influence on social participation. There isn't an interaction between disability and deprived environments. In other words, regardless of your level of disability, if you lived in a deprived environment, you're likely to have lower levels of social participation than those who don't live in a deprived environment. And this shows that graph of the most deprived areas and their social participation. So the 10 and 20% most deprived have the lowest levels of social participation. 20 to 50% have the line in the middle there, levels of participation, and the highest level of social participation are for those in the 50% least deprived areas. So what does all this mean? Well, we can see that increasing disability can be considered as that precipitating event which leads to a decrease in achieved levels of social interaction and social participation. And ultimately, this contributes to those experiences of loneliness. Environmental deprivation has an impact on social participation, but it impacts on all people, regardless of their levels of disability. And rural-urban areas impact on loneliness. Urban areas amplify the effect of disability at appreciable and severe levels of incapacity, but not by influencing the level of social resources or social participation. If they did, we would have seen an interaction effect there. So this is an area that needs further thought and further interpretation. One of the things we didn't include in the model is something about those expectations and desires for support. We have a measure of whether someone actually achieves social participation or achieves levels of social resources. But this particular association we found here may be related to expectations for contact. Perhaps people have lived their lives in urban areas, have higher expectations about contact with family and friends, about participation in social groups. We know, for example, that people in rural areas have very low expectations about service use compared to people in urban areas. Essentially, they've lived there all their lives and don't expect more than they have delivered, even if those are lower levels than they get elsewhere. So this is an area I think we need to explore further with some qualitative data. This model, of course, has some limitations. There are other models that could be tested, and Emily talked about those pathways with outcomes at health at the other end, where I'm talking about them as triggers, as precipitating events for loneliness. This is also cross-sectional. But one of the benefits of the CFAS data is we do have a second wave of data collection coming in, so we will be able to test these effects longitudinally. As I've already said, I think we need some qualitative work to see if those expectations about social relationships and social participation are different in urban and rural areas. But one thing we do know from that the effect of deprivation on social participation is that in deprived areas we could consider ways in which we could provide more opportunities for older people to participate in social groups in these areas, which in turn would contribute to decreasing levels of loneliness. Thank you for your attention.
Vanessa, thank you so much for that. We've been through the same questions.
Yeah.
So wave at me if you have. I'm sure there will be. I can see 1, 2 there. Let's start with the 2 that are just in the middle here to put down. Just wait a moment until you get your microphone. And then when you finish with your microphone, can you pass it to the lady behind you? Yeah. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you say who you are and where you're from?
I'm Katrina Schmidt from Age UK Westminster. I just wanted to know, for my own personal interest, when you're doing studies on older people like this and you're using health or disability as a trigger, do you ever compare these with studies that don't focus on older people? Do you ever look at studies that maybe focus on people that are disabled in their 30s or 40s, and if they're experiencing loneliness on a similar level?
I haven't personally, but I know Christina has published stuff that's looked at the prevalence of loneliness in different populations, but we haven't compared it directly. Mainly because we're experts on research with older people.
No, I just thought it might be like...
Can I maybe throw that open to the room? I know there are a number of researchers here. Is there anyone here who might be able to have a chat with Katrina at lunchtime about their all ages research?
I can tell you, Katrina, though, that we are currently developing a proposal that looks at loneliness across a variety of groups that are excluded, which isn't just older people. So it's included prisoners, people with disabilities, gypsies and travellers, and migrants as well, not older migrants necessarily. So they're all likely to be experiencing some form of exclusion, and we will be looking at the...
I just think it's interesting that everyone's talking about transitions and when people experience loneliness. I think it's interesting to see like the whole lifespan of someone's journey through loneliness. Anyway.
Thanks, Katrina. There's a lady behind you. Are there any other questions that I can take at the same time? Yeah, thank you. Okay, lady behind Katrina.
Sheila Furlong, Director of the Archway Foundation, a charity in Oxford providing a service for adults hurt by loneliness. Thank you to both presenters for excellent presentations this morning. My question is about the definition of disability. Are we talking here just about physical disability, or is any kind of emotional well-being, mental health disability included?
This is
I'll just take the
okay, sorry.
There's a lady at the top there, sorry, I can't see very well. Yes.
Okay, I'm Norma Rings. I'm the director of Regeneration to Generation, and I like to say what excellent presentations we've heard this morning already. When you're going to compare other groups who might experience isolation and loneliness, I suggest very strongly to start looking at mothers with young children. We're always looking at what we call pathological groups. They aren't defined in that way, mainly, but they are very much equal. I think it's useful to make comparisons with. So I would urge you, Vanessa, please to try to include them in your studies, and I'd be interested if anybody else here is involved in that kind of analysis of their experience of this. The other point I want to make is the real importance, it seems to me, of longitudinal work, and I'm very glad to hear that you are actually taking a second way stab at this particular source of data, because when you were talking about some of the factors that predispose people to experience loneliness, it seems to me that some of those things, some of those characteristics of their environments and of them as individuals have been formed a long time back in their life, and they are really important in terms of how we might frame our interventions as well, and they often get overlooked because we don't have this kind of longitudinal data, so it's a key for more longitudinal stories.
Vanessa, I'll let you answer.
I'm going to start with that one.
Yeah.
I've forgotten the first one. Well, you might have to remind me. The single parent group, actually in the same...
Ordinary mothers with kids are very isolated, lonely people often, especially ones with twins.
I was just going to mention that the study that I've just talked about actually is working in partnership with the Single Parent Action Network. So not just mothers, but single parents in Bristol who will be one of the groups in this other study. Longitudinal studies, alongside this particular study, we have been conducting qualitative work which takes a life course perspective on those transitions in and out of loneliness. So we've got a clearer picture of at what points people enter and leave loneliness across their life course. And Deborah Morgan, who's been a PhD student of mine, has found that people develop particular coping mechanisms during their life for coping with loneliness, which carries on. It doesn't suddenly change when you get into later life. So the way that you've dealt with those periods of loneliness earlier in your life will continue to influence the way you experience in later life.
Thanks. I'm just going to pause momentarily.
Okay.
Norma, I'm going to throw your question open to everyone here as well again. Is anyone here aware of or working on loneliness-related research to do with mothers with young children? No, I know we're very, very focused on older age here. I do know, and again I'm looking at my colleague Anna Goodman at the front of all knowledge within the campaign. I do know that Public Health England are working with another organisation on and all pulling together research across all ages. And Norma, I'm happy to let you know more about that. I'm not sure if I can share it with you as such, but I'm certainly happy to let you know more about it. And Sheila, I was so pleased to see you, and I didn't recognise you first from behind the equipment, because I too didn't write down your question.
Disability, I've remembered it.
Right, thank you.
The measure we've used here is the Townsend Disability Score, which actually uses people's ability to conduct ADA, activities of daily living, and instrumental activities of daily living. And it's a cumulative score that collapses those into 5 categories. So if you have no difficulty, then it's no incapacity, up to having, I think it's 6 or more difficulties is severe incapacity, when someone at that extreme end would probably be very much confined to their own home. That's just one way we've sought to capture it in this, but we do have all sorts of other ways we could capture emotional well-being and health, number of chronic conditions, or all sorts of other ways we could do that with this study.
Great, we've got 2 more questions. This is the last round of questions I'm going to take, so if there are any other hands, do give me a wave. Okay, so down at the front here, let's start with the lady that's a bit closer to the microphone to start with.
Me?
No, I'll come to you in a minute. Sorry. Yeah, the lady with the microphone.
Thank you. Victoria from Chorus UK.
as we heard from Emily, various studies use different scales and measures, and I just wanted to ask you why you use the Lubin social network scale and the Dijon 6-item version, and so why you chose them and what your experience was with them.
Okay. I like the Dijon Gearvelt scale because it doesn't use anywhere in it the term loneliness. It's 6 items, it's nice and brief, and it can be divided into emotional loneliness and social loneliness, both of which you can use as scales, and you can also use the final 6 item scale as categories as well, so lonely, not lonely. So it's I think, extremely useful tool to use.
Doesn't it refer to rejection?
It does, but that's not the same as saying, are you lonely?
Can you say a bit more, Vanessa, about why not using the word loneliness is so important?
Yeah, I mean, partly I would steer away from using ones with loneliness in there because of the stigma associated with identifying as lonely. I think in some of the reviews of the loneliness interventions that we've seen, actually the ones that seem to work terribly well are those where they don't say they're intervening to decrease loneliness. It's actually a secondary effect of something else. So trying to get people maybe to self-identify as being lonely has its issues. The Lubin social network scale, I've used that because I've spent a long time using social network typologies, and the Lubin scale was very similar to some of the network typologies I've used. It captures both the quality of a relationship and the quantity of relationships. So it's the number of contacts and the quality of those ties. It's been developed specifically for use with older people. And again, it's one of these measures that has a clinical cut-off point. So you can use it as a scale to say you're more or less isolated, but also there's a clinical point at which you could say this person is isolated and this person's not isolated. It's also been used with people in residential care, so it has a variety of applications. Some of the measures haven't necessarily been tried out with all populations. So that's
Thanks, Vanessa. And the final question from David.
I'm Bruce from South East England.
Just hold on, sorry, just pause a moment for them to hear you, and then everyone can hear you. Thank you.
This is Ruth Rose from South East England, Burholt. You don't seem to have touched very much on those areas where self-confidence is part of the isolation. A lot of mental health work that we're doing in the south of England is about taking these people to a form of learning which they will actually learn to gain confidence, taking them out into confident situations so that they actually overcome their isolation by their own efforts. You don't seem to have touched onto that area of things where self-confidence is a root cause of isolation.
Self-confidence is the cause for some people, but not all. The PhD work I talked about earlier shows that for some people who lack the confidence to go out and join groups or carry on meeting friends, that is where persistent loneliness may be an issue. But because we talk about loneliness in terms of triggers, it is not necessarily continual. People recover from loneliness by themselves. People have coping strategies to do that without an intervention necessarily about increasing confidence. So there are a few people who maybe lack the confidence to do that interventions would help with. The reason that isn't included in this particular presentation is as part of the study team in North Wales, one of my colleagues is working particularly on resilience, and part of that is mastery and confidence, and she's looking at that in terms of this model as well. Where does resilience play a part in these pathways to loneliness? So there will be a whole separate piece of work looking at the effects of that on this particular pathway as well.
Professor Vanessa Burholt from Swansea University, thank you very much.